Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. Slight difference today, actually. I'm going to introduce my co host, Paul Newton. Say hello, Paul.
Hi, everybody.
So Paul is works with me on in itas, but he's for his sins. He's also been a consultant for a number of years prior to working with our solutions team. So he is here today, and we are going to chit chat all about what makes transformation projects successful and kind of the key signs that we think about when we first look at or first look at a project or speak to customers, and how we know whether they're ready to make that journey. So I guess just a bit of background, Paul. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Can do, Hannah. Yeah, thank you. So, as Hannah said, consultant on some finance products for several years before joining itas and Hannah. And since been with itas, looking at the main stage products that we support across that range, but talking to a lot of prospects about what their needs and requirements are with moving forward, and then adding in some of our experience when it comes to the things that we can do to make their journey to a new finance platform a lot smoother and simpler.
Brilliant. So I'm going to hand over the reins. This is a new feeling for me. So everyone knows that I'm not very good at letting go of control. But Paul, I guess, how do I guess, what's your first question and where do you want to start?
I think if I'm looking at it from the outside, if I think about people that we speak to that are maybe being asked to do research or to think about, how they make their processes simpler, I guess the question back to you, Hannah, is kind of how, if it was you and you were coming in and having a conversation with me, even before you get to that stage, how do you decide on kind of the scope of the project and the width of the project? So who should be involved from your side? Is you're just looking at finance, are you bringing in other departments and so on and so forth?
It's a really good question, actually. And I guess that the first thing I would say to anybody that's thinking about going through any kind of project, whether that's a transformation one or not, is just be really clear on what you're trying to achieve. At that early stage, is what is the goal here? Is it cost saving? Is it productivity improvement? Is it enhanced reporting? And because I do feel that sometimes the clarity isn't there. And I guess on the flip side, I would say if you're not sure, then you need to go through an exercise of understanding the potential impact of a transformation project. So have you understood the value that's going to sit within your team? Have you thought about the time that could be saved? Have you have you been clear on what could be done? And then it's down to you to prioritize. So then to answer your question, Paul, then you need to figure out what's the priorities. You also need to, I guess, have a clear idea at that stage as to what the organization is willing to invest. Because I think sometimes you can see the value of what the change is, but at the same time, sometimes there can be limitations in terms of cash flows, budgets, etc., as to what you can. So then you need to prioritize those, what changes you're going to make based on the budgets, the timeframes that you have to do it, and also the appetite that the organization has.
No, great, and I think there's lots of things in there that we can dig into. So certainly from a budgetary standpoint, and when it comes to what the priority is, I guess it's then how you clear all that information. So what are you paying now? What kind of licenses have you got? What integrations have you got that maybe you're not aware of, or what are people doing outside of the system in the likes of Excel, which actually is what's taking time in order to get the right report information up front that you may need as well. So I think it's all of those things to go, actually, if it is just a budgetary thing and you're trying to save money, well, actually, how much are you spending now and what are you willing to spend? But if it is a time-saving point of view, or even another point is how easy is it to get talent who know those products that you're using as well? So how much money would it take to bring more headcount in if you don't get the efficiency savings as well? So lots of really good stuff you can dig into. I think, one of the things that me and you talk about with clients quite a lot is almost, what does the future look like? What are they trying to achieve and where they're trying to get to? So from an integration standpoint, is there anything that you would need to consider when it comes to, big bang versus, maybe phasing a move across as well? Kind of what would be your thought process for that?
Yeah. So when I'm thinking about the change, I'm a big believer in you do small chunks wherever possible, right? And I think the hardest thing about that answer is there's no one size fits all answer that. So it very much depends on the landscape. So I guess the first piece is to understand your landscape. How well integrated are your existing systems? Because if you're going from say a very old legacy system, and you're looking to move that across to multiple different systems because you want to go for more of a best of breed approach, then you need to decide, are there things that we can leave in that system, and do we have a method by which to bring that data across into the new system so that we don't have to do everything at once. So the short answer, I think, is to generally, I always say get the core in first, right? Because it's really hard you need a strong base to build on. So you always start with the core, and then you can normally add different elements around it, i.e. credit control, AP, etc. But if you are migrating from a slightly different setup where there's a lot of pre-existing integrations already, then you may need to take a slightly different approach, and you might need to take more across in the first hit. I guess the flip side of that is that if you're going across in the first, if you are doing a big bang approach, it does put a lot of pressure on the project as a whole. So you need to really think about, is there any way to mitigate the risk of doing that? Because it is genuinely a risk. Because sometimes you're best absorbing a known risk of maybe doing some manual integrations via CSVs for a 3-month period, knowing that that's going to be in another system and integrated properly via APIs. Then you are necessarily the unknown risk of and the pressure that goes onto the team trying to do everything once. So an example of that could be that you've got this full system. So you've got credit control, AP, core all going live at once, but maybe your credit control manager leaves, right? So then you're stuck in a position where that one piece of the puzzle can't go ahead because you need to recruit and they don't really have the capacity because they're filling the gap, etc. So all of a sudden your bigger project's at risk. So there's a risk mitigation. There's also a cash flow piece, because you're not paying for the software if you're not using it. So it can sometimes, you're not kicking that in, but also the implementation cost of that module. So you've got ability to stagger, especially if you've got issues with, or challenges, I'll say, with budget. It's one way to do that. It also adds pressure in terms of outcomes and achievables, because you're trying to impact a lot of departments at once. And just like we use the phrase a lot, jack of all trades, master of none, it's the same as true with projects, right? If you're trying to hit a lot of departments in one hit, very often you'll hit them, but you won't necessarily maximize the effectiveness of every single tick piece. So you're likely to have to do a bit of a loop background to do some optimization and efficiency. So you need to think through that. And I guess the other thing is resource internally, right? The people, I think, sometimes underappreciate the resource it takes to implement new systems, particularly when a team is already under pressure, because it's very rare that we go in where people are thinking far enough ahead about what they're going to need for the next 2 years. Normally it's, oh my gosh, it's the bridge is falling down, we need to get off it and get onto a new one, versus I'm actually thinking 6 months ahead of where my resources are going to be. So you've already got a stretched team. They might already be doing a little bit of overtime or working late at month end to try and get things through. And then you're going to add on a new implementation, which we know is going to make their lives better in 3 months' time. But in the meantime, they're still going to do their day job while implementing a new system. So you really do need to go back to your point, really think about how you can phase, how you can chip things away. Are there small things you can do before you even start the project to create space and resource so that your team have the capacity to deliver this project well?
Great, yeah, and I think that's, again, some really great points. And I guess when it comes to your experience of successful implementations and clients that have been with us for a long time and gone through movement to new products as well, kind of which stages do you think are the most important when it comes to that onboarding stage across the implementation?
I think if you do any one stage badly, a project can fail, right? But I also think the areas where people neglect the most is probably testing, and do you know what? I'm torn between data migration and scope. So testing is the big area where people don't give it enough attention generally, right? And for me, I know who's going to have a smooth transition by the way that they test. Because when you test, you're basically mitigating risk. So those that go through thoroughly test their report, do maybe a little dummy data run to make sure they're comfortable with the data import, that make sure that every team member has been through and thoroughly tested their day-to-day processes. They will identify issues or things that maybe aren't quite perfect. And if there's been a massive scope miss, right, something that's gone maybe not done as well in scope, it normally gets picked up there. So that's, for me, testing is almost your risk mitigation part of the project. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is either one of two things, right? When projects aren't going well, either the testing doesn't get done, so it's not given resource, or it gets, it's not given focus, and or it's not tracked. It's why we're really keen on, like, we provide testing sheets for people to actually work through, so we can actually see what they've done and who's done it. But also, if they elongate the testing period too much, right? So you need focused momentum when you test, not just like, if you open it, say we're going to have a 3 to 6 month testing period, people lose momentum within that. So small focused area of testing with good tracking and accountability, and almost a buy-in from everybody to say, we are doing this. And also thinking about the order in which you do testing. Yeah. So you kind of want super users to go through and do a first round of testing and kind of go, in principle, do we agree this is right? And then you want your day-to-day, once they're happy with that, and generally things work the way they should, you want the everyday users then go through. And once they've entered a volume of data, you then want to go back and do all of the reporting to make sure that the data they've entered matches how you want to get the data out, and you can get the reporting in the way that you want.
No, perfect. And I think, so when it comes to testing, by testing, do you mean dual processing? So in your old product and the new product as well?
No, and I know why you've asked me that question. You're setting me up here, Hippo. So for anyone that has ever spoken to me on the context, I'm a big anti-dual running person, right? Because and the reason for that is just that every single project where they've done it has been challenging, right? So purely because what I see happening is somebody will do that, they'll enter the data, and then there's this everything gets entered into the old system first, normally, as it should, because that's the one you're going to be using. And then what happens is they go to enter the data in the other system, but it gets entered in like bits and sections, and it doesn't always as well go in the way it would if you were fully entering the data, because people go, oh, it's just a test run. Right? So there very often can be a lack of care around that testing, and then also that they're up against it because, as I said before, they're normally not in a position where they've got lots of resource. Otherwise, they generally don't tend to move to a new system because they're not thinking that far ahead. And so you're in that situation where you've got people under pressure trying to double entry, so literally doubling their work, and entering it into a system they're uncomfortable with. So it kind of, in my opinion, and for what I've seen, it kind of breeds a little bit of resentment against the new system that they have to then enter. And what I also find is that those that dual run don't test properly, because they know that they can. In this new system, and then you end up having to, you've done all of this hard work to get the system ready to go live. Everyone's done all their data migration, and then you start finding things that need to be corrected, and because it hasn't been thoroughly tested before. So I have no objections to doing dual running if you have the correct and a reasonable amount of resource. So you actually need to backfill, because you're literally doing everything twice. So you need to have double the resource that you would do normally, or at least 1.5 times the resource. And you also need to make sure you have a thorough testing period, and you need to be really clear on what point you start dual running. Because again, if you don't have either of those, and pretty much most of the projects I've seen over the last 10 years that have done that dual running, that they've used one or two of those excuses. We're really strict on it now, and we really push them hard. But to put this into perspective, I have generally happier customers who have smoother go lives with better, faster impact when they don't dual run, which is, goes against a lot of the historical guidelines. Everyone says, yeah, absolutely, you should dual process. But for what I've seen, people don't have the capacity. They don't have the resource, and they don't have the budget to pay for the extra staff to do that well.
No, great. Yeah. And I was setting you up, Annie, you're quite right. So you mentioned a few times around migration, scoping and data. So coming into a new project and, you're thinking about evaluating new products, when it comes to actually looking at your own data and working out where your data is held in-house, is there a mechanism that you would recommend when it comes to maybe scoring on a data confidence point of view, how up to date and correct your data currently is?
I don't have a framework for doing it necessarily, but I think that a realistic assessment of where your data quality is at is really important, because, again, very often we'll get into conversations about data migration and people will say, oh yeah, I want to bring all of my data across. But then when we actually dig into the detail behind that data, they don't have either the quality or the scope or the confidence in that data to be able to make those changes. And I think it's also it's one of those unsung impacts of process transformation is actually data quality, because as you make processes more efficient, as you remove the manual entry, generally data quality tends to improve. So it's really useful to assess it and say, what would be the value of this data if it was more accurate, produced faster, and we could trust in it? What would be the value of that in terms of business impact? So again, we talked earlier about business case. Mm-hmm. That's one of those thought. Everyone focuses on time and productivity. What they don't focus on is the power of good decision making, and one of those key components of that good decision making is data. So absolutely, if you're not aware of how good your quality, the data quality is, then you really do need to assess it. You can look at things like how well filled out fields are. You could look at things like the quality of the volume of data that's complete, so completeness. You could pull out, maybe do some validation around what fields have been populated, etc. So those are the sorts of things you can look at. But I would have a general rule and maybe a vote of confidence from the exec team, like how well do you trust in your team's data? And if you evaluate the different data sets across the business, where's your weakness? And if finance and or transactional is a weakness, then you need to find a way to adjust it. And you'll see it a lot where you have things like CRMs and finance systems pulling similar reports and getting different answers. So I've had it before. A customer of ours migrated from Sage 50 and Salesforce they had in place, and they used to do their they used to pull rev rec out of their Salesforce system, and it never really, they had some issues reconciling it with their journal management. So that's an example of a real benefit for them as an organization.
Yeah, no, I think, all really relevant points, and I think from a data standpoint as well, it's not even just the confidence in the data, but actually how up to date is that data as well. And is there any compliance that you need to consider about data that you may have in your systems as well when it comes to GDPR and data protection and lots of other things as well. So when we're scoping and we're looking at evaluations of new finance systems, I think there's other things that we need to consider as well. And I think one of the things that people often think about are what are their key dates, what are their milestones, but also how do they measure the success of any new project as well. So what kind of things or themes have you seen in the past when it comes to people being able to measure success maybe 3 or 6 months into the project?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things you need to realize, I think a lot of finance people need to just kind of acknowledge, is that it's not just about the impact on finance, but the impact on the wider business. So one of the questions I love to ask is, how has the perception of finance changed? since you
Mm.
implemented said system, right? And that tells me a lot. Um, a couple of the conversations that I've had have been actually we're brought to the table more because we add more value, because we can access data faster, we can provide reports. They say now they've seen some data, they keep asking us for more, which is great because it's changing that piece. But also you'll hear things like we have time to do those kind of activities. So they're sort of like I guess the golden words that I'm looking for when I see the success. But for me, success depends on what you're trying to get out to. And it goes back to where we started the conversation, Paul, that piece around knowing why you're doing something and actually writing down and having that piece of paper there to say, we are doing this because it's going to deliver this amount of productivity. We want it to reduce month end by this many days. Yeah. We want to have we want to be able to pull a report across multiple systems and have the same data appear. We want to be able to we want to improve our cash flow, so we need better credit control, etc. So I think you need to put a few statements around your objectives down, and then when you get out the other side, then evaluate that. But what's also interesting is what are the other benefits that you didn't necessarily look for, but you've got from that change. So I've had it before with some customers, and they said, actually, we didn't expect this particular impact, but it's just happened because we've implemented. And that's why I love case studies. We do. I'm the lucky person that gets to interview all of our case studies and our customer stories, and I just love it because it's really interesting once you start speaking to them around those objectives. But I also think it's really important to be clear that value isn't just about time saved or money saved.
Hmm.
There's real and tangible values. There's lots of monetary impacts. So when you put your business case, you need to think about how much money is going to be saved, and then add in the interest. Think about customer service impact. Ability to look at margins. All of those have an impact on the bottom line. But then there's also your intangibles, the perception of finance, the ability to be able to impact decisions, the speed of reporting. All of those are really hard to quantify, but actually sometimes can actually be more impactful than saving some hours,
Yeah.
finance saving some hours.
No, great. And I think obviously one of the decisions that you would need to make as part of this process is who to work with. So externally, who do you trust as a partner? The solution that you're going for. How do you trust that as well? So I guess obviously we are a partner. We'd recommend ourselves to everybody. However, are there any questions as a CFO looking, or as a finance manager looking, and going, actually, these are the type of questions that I should be asking any partner that I'm going to work with, to make sure I'm confident in their ability, but also that they've worked in the similar industries, and understand the type of things that I'm trying to change in the business.
Yeah, I think industry is a good piece. I wouldn't let it stop you, but I think it's a really good indicator because they tend to be able to add more value because they'll either have some IP that's relevant to that industry, or they'll have some best practice that they can share. So finding those that align with industry is really good. But I also think, customer stories is the first point, or wherever possible, speak, or look at customer stories, because you need to find someone that's in a similar position and understand the journey that they went on. Um, but a lot of people focus on the implementation without thinking about the fact that they're entering into a long-term relationship with this partner, and it's not just about the initial implementation, it's about the second or third piece, maybe the ongoing improvement and optimization. It's the support that they offer, basic things like they haven't asked if they can phone their support team and have a conversation with somebody. What's the level of interaction like? I also think it's really important to think about, what happens if scope creep happens? How do you manage that together? How do they manage things when things go wrong? Because it's not normally when things are perfect that you get issues with any partner. It's when things aren't quite going to plan. So being really clear and asking them to be clear about what's your responsibilities in the project
Hmm.
and what's theirs. Because if your guys have got your back against the wall and you're super busy, having a partner that expects you to do a lot of the heavy lifting isn't going to work. So, just because you've got a budget restraint, that's not always the right decision. So you need to go into these kind of projects and ask the questions of your partner. And um, it's not necessarily about they can't offer it. It's about making sure that you're both on the same page in terms of who is doing what they need from you, and what you're going to need from them. And also thinking, I guess, a bit about outside technical, because again, I think implementations, particularly around finance, are about more than just do they have a technical understanding of the solution? There needs to be more to it. So I would really encourage you to dig into their ability to actually transform and change. And again, the best way you can measure that is with customer impact statements and reference sites. That's the biggest way that you can see the value in a partner.
Great, yeah, and I think certainly for from what we talked about earlier when it comes to big bang versus phased as well, if you're going to go down the phased route, then obviously we need to be you need your partner to be on the ball when it comes to keeping you in kind of on the track for those phases and checking in with is it stop or go at that point for the next phase and the phase after that. You did mention optimization as part of that answer as well, Hannah. So what do you mean by optimization?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to my statement around this is a journey that you're embarking on. Your initial implementation is not your final destination. And I think so, optimization, you need to think about, like, on your journey through this new system for at least 2 to 3 years. You need to be thinking about, how do we continue to get the value out of this investment? So, what do I mean by that? So, you should be going back to the questions that we've been asking. So things like, are you doing regular reviews and assessments of how you could use the system more effectively? Does your partner offer the support and service around that? What's the ongoing education piece that you can access, whether that's paid for or whether that's included in your contract? And what happens after you go live? Because it's almost, I do feel like sometimes people come in with the blinders on about it's just about the implementation, but
Hmm.
actually the success, and certainly if you think about how fast technology is changing, is with the continual development of systems. So asking questions of your software provider, how often do you bring out update? Things like that can really give you an insight into how much effort and potential investment you might need to make in keeping on top of things. But also, you should make sure you budget for it as well, because that's again something. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can do it with audit days and assessment days. So you can have consultants come in and assess your system on a regular basis. If you're lucky, you hopefully have a really good account manager to help you through that process where you can do that. There's also a lot of things that you can do yourselves as a team, is to keep, whenever you hit something that isn't that efficient or effective, or you wonder if there's a better way, is just write it down. So have a shared list as a team of all the things that perhaps you've not got time to look at right now because you're in the middle of month end, but when you get a chance to go back through, you can come back and again, that is a way of, because it could be that somebody knows the answer, it could be you take that to your account manager for your software, but again, you're looking to continue to optimize. So I think there's a couple of things on that. So one, have an internal process where you record potential ways to improve or areas to focus on. Two, make sure you have a budget around ongoing optimization, training, and development, and that your
Hmm.
team have resource and time set aside to do those things like training and optimization. And three, have a plan. Especially when you're going down the phase delivery route, always keep the next project in mind, and not just big projects like a big integration piece, but maybe it's just an optimization of a report that at the moment you have to do
Hmm.
manually. So just, and tick those things off. And just like any transformation project, recognize when you do it, brilliant. And then make sure that you have that ongoing list, because that snowball effect, I talk about it a lot, but it happens not just during the implementation, but also after. and you can really create some massive capacity if you do small changes every year. And I love the story about the Olympics team. It was the cycling team, and they looked at every part of their process. They looked at, how well they slept, how well they ate, how well the bikes ran, how much muscle power they had, the speed, the stamina. So they looked at every single part in isolation, and they looked for that just 1% impact. And overall, it delivered a massive result for them, and they won gold. So that for me is a really great example that we should be taking from in transformation.
No, and I think anyone who hasn't read that about Sir Dave Brailsford absolutely should, because those marginal gains made a huge difference with the amount of goals that Team GB brought in. So, and that can be used across all areas of business. So yeah, really great analogy, Hannah. Obviously, we're talking a lot about the end of the project here and the continual phasing of the project as well. But just thinking about going back to the start again, we may have some people watching the podcast and thinking, I'm not at the stage even yet where I'm ready to fully evaluate. So are there things that I can be doing now in order to start building a business case so I can go and seek investment and budget and make sure that it's good to evaluate. So I'm thinking, when I'm speaking to clients about when they're saying, actually, we get random requests for different parts of the business for reports that take me a lot of time, or, I'm not sure if we're making a profit on this certain service that we're providing. Kind of what would your advice be for somebody in that position where they're aware they need to change, but they're not quite sure how they get that across to the rest of the business?
So for me, I think like anything, you need to start recording. And I think those two are really good examples of things that you should be noting down. But I actually did a financial transformation live session on doing a business case. And that worked really well for the non-obvious piece. And so the one that, if you haven't listened or watched that FT live, I would genuinely recommend it if you're in that sort of early stage, because we walk through all of the different areas where you could focus on in terms of building a business case. So things like, figuring out that, okay, we've saved this, we've brought, for credit control, we've brought, we've reduced it. What does that do in terms of cost of things like loans and cash flow? Those untold costs that sort of you don't actually realize you've got until you've done it. So going through an exercise to actually assess the business case is probably, I would say, one of the first things that you should consider, because then it'll tell you whether you've actually got budget to go through and do those changes. So if you're at that early stage, I would definitely think about doing that sort of assessment of where you can see value. But, there's no reason you can't start those small changes now to start, chipping away and keeping those list of niggles and issues so that you've got things to hand that you can use as evidence. One other thing I always recommend is, depending on like the objectives that you're looking to achieve. So once I think there's a difference between why you should do it. That's where the business case come in, but also what you should do. So key things that you should consider to sort of assess where you need to make changes are things like a month-end timeline mapping, an Excel audit, so assessing what Excel spreadsheets you've got across the business, and time mapping, so looking at each of the roles within the business and seeing where they spend their time, so that you can understand, how much, where you actually need to focus your budget and priority in that.
Great, and I guess as well off the back of that, it's also, I think a lot of people in finance feel siloed to other parts of the business. They generally just only get asked questions at the very end of a process, or they get informed about changes maybe that are happening across the business. So from a proactive point of view and other areas of the business that you need to reach out of, I'm thinking straight away from, one of the questions I'm going to ask you if you speak to me is kind of, what are your IT requirements? Are you hosting internally, or do you need cloud? Kind of how do we make sure that you're clear with kind of any other objectives and roadmaps and goals that might be in the business as well?
Yeah, I think like all of these is I would hope that you work with partners that would help you understand the things that you need to think about. That's always the piece. But yes, thinking about your infrastructure, thinking about, are your processes mapped out, and do you have some basic guidelines? Do you actually know what your processes are? Is your data is your data clean enough for you to migrate? Do you need to start doing those cleanup exercises? So I think there's lots of things to consider around an implementation other than just sort of the cost of doing that implementation.
Hmm.
And I also think there's some really key considerations about when you do migrate, like what time of year, and timing that right can have, again, a real impact on the I guess the success of a project.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think it certainly leads us on to the considerations as well. So, term time, holidays, busiest periods of the year, Christmas as a prime example as well, or the December program period. When people say, actually, I want to be live in January, you know, actually who's around in order to do testing in December. That's one of the things that you absolutely need to consider as well. So perfect. I think lots of information that we've gone through so far, and probably a lot to digest. I'm going to ask a yes or no question as well, which I wouldn't normally do. Is there such a thing as a perfect implementation?
The perfect implementation is one that achieves its objective. So I think there is, yeah, but
Okay.
um, are you going to have an implementation where nothing goes wrong? No, because if it is, you've missed something. Being very, very honest, right? There's always going to be some things, hopefully small, that slips up, right? But I guess that's the point of good project management and a good partner, is that they're there to lift you up. Your project management helps you avoid the obstacles, or minimizes the risk. So you've always got a backup plan. And your partner should be there to offer advice and guidance when things do wrong. Because something will happen. It'll be somebody, is off sick on a key date, or, you've gone through a process and it doesn't really work in real life. So you just need to tweak it a little bit to make it work. And you hope that all of those things should be minor. But I think setting a realism, you're better setting your expectations lower for what you're looking to achieve, particularly the business's expectations. That's one thing I always say is don't set a bar so high you're really going to have to reach to do it. Like, set it at a medium level so it has impact and it delivers. And then when you surpass that, you and your finance team look amazing to the rest of the organization when you start delivering bits that they didn't even expect. So there is I don't think there's anything as such as, when I say, perfect implementation, where nothing goes wrong and everything goes to plan. There's always something small, but I guess the side of a good implementation is one where those imperfections aren't noticed and they don't impact your ability to achieve the objectives.
Yeah, great. I think, certainly from my standpoint, and when I've seen implementations in the past, to your point, Hannah, as you're going through training and testing, there may be something where you go, actually, that process just doesn't quite work now. And that's where, you need the thorough testing, but also a really adaptable partner who can then just jump on and do things without you incurring a huge cost for doing that as well. I think that's also a consideration. So a lot of that comes back to scoping, and we have mentioned scoping a couple of times. So imagine I've never gone through a scoping with anyone. What are the things that I'm going to be asked? How should I be coming into a scoping session from an expectation and an understanding what my accountabilities and responsibilities are?
So I think when you go into a scoping, I think you need to, if I had the dream, I love it when customers come in and they've got their current as is processes mapped out,
Mm-hmm.
or are able to talk about them well. So the
Yeah.
first thing is, I think you need to make sure you have the right people in the room. As a CFO, you may not be the person that knows the AP processes and all the scenarios, and that's perfectly fine and acceptable because you're busy with other things. But make sure you have people in the room that are able to talk about that. But also make sure that those people in the room are really clear about the why behind the change, because what can be really hard as a consultant is you need to obviously work with those individuals to talk through the existing processes. But very often when you're implementing a new system, there's going to be an element of change. And if you've got people that don't want to change, or are unaware or not on board with the change, that scoping process becomes really difficult. So I personally love it when a CFO sits in on as many scope sessions as possible, because yes, they get to see the understanding, but also very often they'll realize things they didn't even know are happening within the organization. So it's a really good opportunity for them, but it also allows them to see where we've got a little bit of resistance. and to, in the background, perhaps be working with that individual, making sure their KPIs align with this project, making sure they understand the reason for change, and helping guide and remind everybody about the why. So I think, yeah, so from a scoping perspective, I think it's really important to have, the right people in the room. If you have the option to have process maps and system and in system maps, so if you, especially if you've got lots of different systems doing different things, like almost like a guide for the team, that's scoping as to what systems you've got and what they do. Um, and then thinking about, if you have got lots of systems, when you bring those partners in. So that should be a conversation that your partner's having with you about starting to bring those partners in. But, like anything, part of this, I like to have these conversations, is that, your partner may not may not think about those things in the same way that we do. So those are the sorts of things that I would think about as part of your scope.
No, great. And I think, to kind of, absolutely bring the right people in, but bring the people in who live it and breathe it, and they know the workarounds that maybe have had to be implemented in the past, or the things that take them time, because this is the ideal time and scope to get that out on the table to see if there's a better solution or a simpler way to make that process work better in the new system as well. So yeah, really, really great point, Hannah. So I guess we've talked a lot about kind of, if we think about everything we've talked about, we've thought about kind of how to start even thinking about evaluating, how to build a business case. We've then talked about kind of engaging with a partner and being prepared for them to ask you lots of questions when it comes to things that you do in your business. But then into scoping, into training and testing, and then for, I guess, post go live as well when it comes to optimization sessions. Is there anything that you also would say, actually, regardless of everything that we've talked about so far, is there a part of the process that you think that we've missed when it comes to how you make transformation a big success across the business?
The only thing I would say is that you need to go into this project with an openness to change, right? I think you need to make sure your expectations are realistic. And I've mentioned this, but I just kind of really want to emphasize it, is that when you're swapping out systems, and I'm assuming that, when we talk about transformation, talking about changing systems and processes, things are going to change, right? And so in order to achieve like the benefits of that change, that there's always a downside. The downside is that you need to get everything else working around it. And I think one of the challenges of finance, it's not always the finance processes that need to change. It might be something that's happening in sales or that. So I guess, as a CFO, you need to be prepared to be that stakeholder voice across the organization, to go and have those conversations with other teams, and other individuals, to try and help them understand the reason for change. So I think that's the other thing is, communication's key. So it's really important that you continue to communicate around the project internally, but it's also key to identify nice and early if there are going to be impacts on the wider business or things are going to change, that you communicate that ahead of time so that when it happens, it's not a big shock and the project doesn't have to go on pause while some of those change conversations are happening. So I would say that's the other thing, just to be mindful, especially in that CFO role or the finance leader role, is that's kind of your key piece within this project. You may not be necessarily doing the doing, but what we need as as a transformation team from you is for you to be that communicator and to also give us feedback both ways, to make sure that we're getting the feedback from that wider stakeholder group in terms of reporting requirements, that you're able to act as that voice into the other teams as well to have those conversations. So
fantastic. No, I think really absolutely relevant point. And I think it's almost from a partner standpoint as well. I often think as I'm going through kind of pre-sales and demos, and then even before we get to the point of getting anywhere near a scope, was actually who's the champion for this project, who's the person who really believes in the product and believes in the partner, and then how do we make sure that person's also communicating with the CFO, and try and keep them involved all the way through. Because I think from a change standpoint, having somebody internally who is a champion of both the partner and the product certainly makes implementation a lot more straightforward moving forwards as well. So yeah, lots of really relevant points. So how have you found being interviewed, Hannah?
It's very different. I'm not used to it, to be very honest, Paul. But thank you for jumping in. And guys, if you're listening to this session, I'd love your feedback. Have you got something out of today's podcast? Has it added value? Because that for us is we're going to be playing with formats over the next 3 to 6 months. We're going to be trying some new topics, some new ways of us going through this podcast. I'd love your feedback. Because again, this podcast is for you, our listeners, and I want to make sure that it's delivering what you would value out of the podcast. So tell me what you liked, what you didn't. Tell me perhaps some topics that you'd be really interested in learning more of. And yeah, would love to see what you think of my co-host, and maybe this becomes a double trouble, as we could say. So. But thanks, Paul, for joining me on this podcast. And thank you to our listeners for joining yet another episode of CFO 4.0. And yeah, we're looking forward to speaking to you next time on the CFO 4.0 podcast.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, everybody.